Hjertelig velkommen til Health Talk-podcasten. Mitt navn er Kasper Lorentzen, og jeg er journalist i Health Talk. Og nå skal jeg bytte til engelsk, because today we are joined by Simon Couillard, a leading Canadian key opinion leader in asthma and lung diseases. You're also an assistant professor and clinical researcher at Sherbrooke University and have done extensive research on asthma. Thank you, Simon, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Casper. I'm glad to be here in Norway. It's a beautiful country.
Thank you. In this episode, we will discuss why early intervention is critical for asthma patients. But first, let's start with talking about how you see the current state of asthma care today.
Thank you for the question. So, asthma is a disease that we know is based on twitchy airways, reversible airway limitation. But importantly, it is often characterized by a lot of inflammation. Not always, though. So asthma is a heterogeneous disease of the airways that are twitchy and often with a lot of inflammation. Despite this heterogeneity, all asthma is approached by a common scale of therapy that is titrated according to symptoms. So if a patient has a lot of shortness of breath, a lot of wheezing, or has had a lot of asthma attacks, they will inevitably end up on maximal treatment, which is good because that means everyone gets treated. Everyone gets their shot at high-intensity therapy, but it is also bad because it means that we often wait until a lot of damage has occurred before getting to the best therapy available, which is potent anti-inflammatory drugs. And it also means some people are unnecessarily escalated. Sure, modern drugs are great. There's a lot of safe drugs out there, and most asthma drugs are safe, but some, such as systemic corticosteroids, are awful. They maim patients, they cause harm to the patients. And if we could avoid such therapies in these patients, that would be great. So the current landscape is not recognizing that asthma is a heterogeneous disease, approaches asthma with a one-size-fits-all escalation of therapy, which leads to unnecessary escalation to some and late escalation in others.
And how well would you say that we are diagnosing and following up with patients early?
I think that would depend on the country. I can speak certainly for Canada and other North American countries. Around a third of patients who are labeled with asthma actually do not have asthma. So there's a overdiagnosis problem, but there's also an underdiagnosis problem, which means that around 40 patients of people that should have asthma diagnosed are not diagnosed. And finally, in my country, when you ask someone for an asthma diagnostic test, it can take 1 or 2 years until they get the final testing done. And those tests are done based on lung function, so the twitchiness of the airways, as I was mentioning earlier. So lung function is measured by spirometry, and we cause asthma attacks with controlled bronchoconstriction challenges. But these are complicated tests for patients and do not inform on what I mentioned is a crucial handle for better management of disease, in my opinion, is the inflammation problem. And we'll talk about that. But currently the diagnosis largely relies on physiology, is cumbersome, and is not done appropriately in many patients. And then, of course, enters the stepwise escalation when you have the diagnosis done. So that also is a problem where I think inflammation monitoring might be important.
And what does research tell us about benefits about starting treatment early?
That's a great question. So the research certainly shows that when you have an asthma diagnosis, you should be approached with as needed anti-inflammatory reliever. What that means is a patient can have a therapy that both rescues symptoms but also treats the inflammation if there is any. The second thing is that if we were able to identify the risk of individual patients earlier, I think we would be in a stronger position to determine, this patient, I've just diagnosed them, but there's something really wrong or really worrying with this patient, and we need to escalate. Currently, that is only done with lung function without looking at the activity of the inflammation, the activity of the disease. So earlier intervention is important for the basic step of earlier diagnosis, and intervention is important for the basic step of using anti-inflammatory reliever therapy. But again, there's a missed opportunity for earlier risk stratification, I think.
And you've published important data on predict and prevent models in severe asthma. Can you explain how these approaches can change daily practice?
Thank you for your intervention on my data. I'm very happy to share it. So it's not just on severe asthma, actually. So we realized when looking very carefully at trial data. So for the listener, a clinical trial is the top level of quality of data. Patients do not know that they are randomized to placebo, for example. Placebo means no therapy. So you basically have asthma and you participate in a trial, but unfortunately or fortunately, you're randomized to placebo. And then we monitor you for a year. And whether you have mild, moderate, or severe asthma, we were able to show that the inflammation level when entering the trial, measured by two very simple tests, a blood eosinophil count, that's a full blood count, a normal routine blood test. When you have anemia, the doctor will usually order this test. So a lot of people will have a blood count in their record already. And a high blood eosinophil count was associated with a risk of asthma attacks. It could be almost 50% higher if at least 50% higher when you had a blood eosinophil count which was markedly abnormal. And the second aspect is fractional exhaled nitric oxide, which is called FeNO. That's a measurement that we can do in the airways. It's available in asthma clinics in Norway additionally. So these tests didn't inform on the risk of asthma attacks in these placebo-treated patients. This is on top of other factors. So I'm not saying measure just numbers in patients. Patients are patients. You need to know the clinical history if they had previous asthma attacks. I think lung function is also a parameter that associates with risk, but the contributions of symptoms and lung function are quite low to the risk of asthma attacks. And in the end, this study showed, which we called Oracle 2, really determined that inflammation is a key risk factor for asthma attacks. And that's important because we know this inflammation can be acted upon with anti-inflammatory therapy, be it higher dose inhaled corticosteroids, so anti-inflammatory inhaled therapy, or even biologics. So that's the predict and prevent approach. Measure the risk that you can treat and treat it potentially the backbone of that is to treat it earlier. We need trials to do that. Conversely, I want to bring a second point on aspect of this. I talk a lot about risk, treat. Well, there are some patients in my clinic I can inform that you have a good form of asthma. If I had one form of asthma to have, it would be yours. You have low inflammation, low risk of asthma attacks. It's unnecessary that I escalate your therapy. You'll probably get side effects, but no benefits. Patients are very reassured and also thankful to get that piece of information as well. So it's not just about bad prognosis, it's about a good prognosis and preventing harms of therapy.
You mentioned milder forms of asthma. Do you think there are elements of this group that we underestimate?
That's an amazing problem that you're bringing up. So some people with very mild asthma or mild asthma are still treated with just a blue inhaler, so as needed reliever, no anti-inflammatory therapy. And these patients, if they use too much of their blue inhaler, their salbutamol, their rescue reliever, without treating the inflammation, they're at risk of asthma attacks. And that's crucially really true for people with a high blood eosinophil count. So we know now that very mild asthma, everyone should have an approach with as needed anti-inflammatory reliever therapy. My point is, I think, and I know people with very mild asthma or mild asthma can have an asthma attack. And rather than waiting and sitting in primary care, continuing to have issues and damage, if they have high inflammation, I think that would be an ideal candidate to be fast forward, to go the fast lane. So there's a slow lane and the fast lane. The fast lane goes for people that are at risk. They had even a small issue, lung function dip, asthma attack, a high symptom burden, but especially they have a lot of inflammation, fast lane escalation and referral to a specialist. The slow lane is for people that have a good prognosis, no inflammation, normal lung function. These patients can certainly be handled by the primary care with as needed anti-inflammatory reliever. So 2 different lanes, one fast and one slow. There is, of course, middle ground in there, and nothing is perfect. So still need doctors.
How have biologic therapies changed the treatment landscape for asthma?
It's been so a biological therapy is a monoclonal antibody. It's an antibody that we synthesize and direct to a target. The ones that we target right now are directed towards cytokines. That is a type of signaling molecule in the system. When we take them out, they're extremely safe. So that's the first thing to say. We can take out a single cytokine from the human body, and there's in asthma, and there's virtually no side effect from that perspective. However, of course, there are some skin reactions that are possible and allergies, but that's very rare, thankfully. So the first thing is that these drugs are generally safe, and to your point, they're highly effective. So because these drugs are expensive, the first trials were done in severe asthma. So what we call end-stage asthma. So the patient comes in, they've had three asthma attacks in the last year. They have a lot of inflammation. Their lung function is already down to 50%. Actually, in many of these trials, you had to be below 80% of lung function to get in, which means you have to be damaged to get into the trial, which is quite sad. And then we see amazing results. Patients, especially those with a lot of inflammation, they virtually get normal lives back. Their asthma attack rate goes down by 50 to 70% if they have a lot of inflammation. So that's a lot of asthma attacks less per year. It makes a noticeable difference for these patients. Their lung function can normalize. And in some patients, we see what we call remission. So the patient lives a normal life, and they say, why on earth did I have all these asthma attacks when I could have had this therapy earlier? Now, that's what we know on biologics and severe asthma. And of course, the obvious question is, could we act earlier? That would take a lot of resources, cost a lot, unless you know who to treat earlier, who will benefit most, and who really needs it the most earlier. So that's the entire predict and prevent idea, is to find those patients, treat them earlier, the right patient at the right time with the right drug.
Would you say that it's realistic that this can be a part of everyday practice?
Well, that's a good point. So people naysayers will always say that we currently struggle to get spirometry done. However, actually, the blood eosinophil count is something that is more accessible than a spirometer. So that's a lung function test compared to a blood test. If we take GPs, for example, they're used to doing these kind of biomarker algorithms. Blood pressure is measured all the time and treated. Cholesterol is a blood test. People will measure it and treat it. And they know that will remove the risk of asthma attacks associated with that parameter. So it can be done from a scientific perspective, because we know GPs are excellent in that. And from a technical perspective, a blood eosinophil count at the very least is very easy to do. Pheno currently is, undergoing transformation and will get cheaper and cheaper with time. But I suspect these tests would be all very much cost-effective to do when implemented in the right stratification scheme, compared to doing treating patients with asthma attacks, hospitalizations, emergency room visits, of course, the comorbidity associated with corticosteroids, which are the mainstay of asthma attack therapy. So there is, I think, a realistic way of doing this. Of course, biologics cost a lot, and that's where I think identifying the right patient for these trials, for society to decide who really we should be paying for these drugs earlier, I think that would make sense to me.
And you mentioned a few earlier, but what would you say are the biggest barriers to implementing early intervention in real-world clinics?
Certainly, I think we still need to get our story right. So the guidelines currently still advocate largely, despite the new inclusions, thanks to our work of biomarkers in the guidelines. Unfortunately, the main messaging is still that symptoms should be measured and treated aggressively, which I think yields to the problems we noticed in the beginning. So we need to get our story right, and for that we need data. So as a scientist, I'll have to say we need to have the best data possible. It's not a job about shouting loud. It's a job about making the best science available, which we did, I think, in a certain respect with our trial analysis of placebo arms. And then we need obviously a clinical trial, a real clinical trial with intervention arm and placebo, showing that measuring biomarkers earlier, treating the hot patient even after a single asthma attack, treating them earlier, we can get the best possible outcomes, because we know from different analyses that there are hints of the current data sets that early intervention would be best. So it is about getting our storyline right in the guidelines, our communication scheme good with GPs after that, and also in parallel running the right trials. So there's still a lot to do, and I still have my work cut out for me in the future, and I'd be happy to have more people working with us on this topic. It's really an exciting time to be working in asthma.
Yeah, that's interesting. How would you say you see asthma treatment evolving over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Oh, I'd love it. If I knew everything, I'd be big on the stock market, wouldn't I? So the first thing I think is access to biomarkers, I think will increase. Their evidence is going that way, that biomarkers are real predictors of risk that you can action. And people buy into it. People that hear about it say, hey, this might be more interesting than symptom-based management. So I think that will progress. And hopefully our work continues to work in that perspective. The second thing is I think we will slowly but surely move away from one-size-fits-all treatment and monitoring and treatment of asthma attacks themselves. So usually an asthma attack means a patient has a flare of symptoms and they get steroids, systemic steroids, which are highly effective but very harmful. I think we will move towards, in certain cases, maybe hospital-based therapy could be more targeted and more appropriate with a biologic. And the third theme is, I said earlier that current biological drugs specifically target one cytokine. I think the future is multiple targeting, so different cytokines can be taken out to more completely suppress the inflammation cascade. So without going into details, broad-acting agents are showing superiority in certain respects, and I think that is a common theme that will continue in the future. And hopefully this ties in with early intervention as well, with the broader intervention earlier in the right patient, in the targeted right patient.
We're nearing the end of the podcast, but one last question. If you had one key message for healthcare professionals and policymakers about early intervention in asthma, what would you say?
I think it's about recognizing that simple tests that are available, such as the blood sniff count and FeNO, identify an opportunity. I call it a high-stake situation. High stake as in gambling, you know? There's a lot of money on the table. There's a lot of risk for the patient if they lose that opportunity to intervene earlier. And if we can just measure the risk, we can identify that high-stake situation and intervene with the best possible outcomes, such as remission. I'm not saying treat all patients like this. This would cost a lot for society, but I think there's at least a 10 to 20% of asthma patients that are hanging out there with a lot of information, a lot of problems, a lot of risk, that we could really change our lives earlier rather than waiting. And as firefighters being called on a fire scene, you know, we arrive and the building is burned down. Let's predict and prevent these events and find them earlier and treat them earlier. So I think the idea is very simple and appealing. It's just about getting the evidence right, and that's the job of scientists such as myself. And I'd like to thank you, Casper, for having me the opportunity to discuss this. It's an exciting time for me as a clinical researcher, and I'd be happy to have Norwegians, patients, or students write to me that they want to get onto this new train of thought.
Yeah, that's very interesting work that you do, and thank you so much for the informative chat, Simon.
Skål!
Og takk for at du lyttet til denne episoden av Health Talk-podcasten. Jeg vil gjerne oppfordre dere til å abonnere eller følge oss på din foretrukne plattform, slik at du ikke går glipp av en episode. Og takk for nå.